after the recent events of the Trump administration. I was watching CNN the other day and I saw a graphic that said the Trump White House. And for some reason, it just seemed to have an extra charge. It just seemed to be a little bit unsettling to see that particular juxtaposition, which ordinarily would be something that we would take for granted. My name is Kevin Gaines, and I am on the faculty here at the Africana Studies Research Center. And I'm a historian, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce our colleagues who will be presenting. We're going to give brief presentations, just giving our reactions to the current moment. I think a lot of people were really concerned with the abruptness of the transition from the Obama administration to having a racist in the White House and having white supremacists and white nationalists in the government in places where they can do a great deal of harm. And so to try to put this moment in perspective, we organized this panel, a history of official white supremacy, and we look forward to your questions and comments afterward. So let me introduce my fellow presenters. We'll hear from Nolowe Rooks, who is an associate professor in Africana Studies and Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And she works on, she's written 3 books, and she's worked on the racial implications of beauty, fashion and adornment, racial inequality in education, race, food, and the politics of the city in Black women's studies. Her work explores how race and gender both impact and are impacted by popular culture, social history, and political life in the United States. And her forthcoming book is tentatively titled Cutting School, Apartheid Education and the Big Business of Unmaking Public Education. And that's forthcoming from the New Press. We will also hear from our colleague Siba Grovogi, who is a professor of international relations, theory, and law at the ASRC. And Professor Grovogi is currently completing 2 manuscripts. The first, which is nearly completed, is entitled Otherwise Human, Human and Humanitarian Rights Traditions. And his second book manuscript is tentatively titled Future Anterior, A Genealogy of International Relations and Society. And this second project examines the past of international relations with particular regard to the identities, values, and roles of multiple agents, subjects, and actors in bringing about international relations and international society. So I think we will proceed. I will begin with my presentation, which is on Woodrow Wilson as a sort of a paradigmatic example of the centrality of white supremacy in the US government. And one of the things that's really important to consider as I talk about the racism in US domestic and foreign policy in the early 20th century is how overt racism was, how accepted the kinds of racism that we don't hear as much, as often, so crudely expressed in polite society, in public and political discourse today after the Civil Rights Movement. It really is unacceptable to talk about racism the way people commonly did at the turn of the century in the United States. But it's really worth bearing in mind how accepted this kind of overt racist discourse was. So Wilson was elected president in 1912, and African-American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter endorsed Wilson, who ran as a Democrat. And of course, the Democratic Party at that time was the party of white supremacy. It was the party of white supremacy in the South. But black leaders like Du Bois and Trotter were so disenchanted with the Republican Party and its retreat from its historical legacy of being the party of Reconstruction and the party supporting equal rights and black voting rights, that they supported Wilson. And so Wilson immediately disappointed them by establishing segregation in federal office buildings. African American appointees in the federal bureaucracy had been a prominent feature in American life since Reconstruction. And so Wilson shocked people when he took this step. This is a moment in U.S. history in which there is certainly a turn towards a much more vicious racism. It's a time in which there is a tremendous problem of lynching between 1880 and 1920. There were something like over 4,000 recorded lynchings. And the NAACP is founded around the same time. It's founded in 1910, and its main agenda is to push for federal anti-lynching legislation. And of course, Wilson is not interested in that. There has been recently a revival of interest in Woodrow Wilson and his legacy as president and as someone who presided over a turn towards white supremacy in U.S. governance. Students at Princeton University, where Wilson had been the president of the university before his political career, protested against the sort of enshrinement of Wilson and his legacy at Princeton University. And so that rekindled debate on Wilson's racist legacy. And there was some discussion among descendants of the federal employees who lost their jobs as a result of Wilson's draconian anti-black policies. So this is obviously an issue that is still debated. But I will actually talk about Wilson's role in promoting white supremacy, which far outlasted the years of his administration. He left office in 1918 around World War I, or the conclusion of World War I. So I need to, I have some visual aids that I think you would probably find useful. Okay, so Wilson is known also for promoting, using the White House, using his office to promote the film Birth of a Nation, which was a landmark in American cinema and a source of a huge political controversy at the time of its release in 1915. It comes from a trilogy of novels by the North Carolina writer Thomas Dixon, who wrote a trilogy. He really felt that the white South was being maligned by the rest of the country for its treatment of African Americans during the Reconstruction period. And so Dixon recalled hearing a speech by a liberal minister in Boston in the 1880s on the Southern problem, and the speech was basically an attack on the white South's racist opposition to Reconstruction and African American voting rights. And so he was so put out by this that he was inspired to write this series of historical novels, one of which was entitled The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, of course, was the white terrorist organization that was founded in the South during Reconstruction, during the 1860s, to intimidate African Americans from becoming politically active, registering for the vote, asserting their political rights. So The Klansman was actually a bestseller and a great success. And Dixon hit on the idea of turning it into a movie. And of course, the film medium was new at this time. He found a director in D.W. Griffith, who was a filmmaker from Kentucky, who shared obviously the racist views portrayed in the novel. And the film was previewed in New York City. It was very controversial. People were sort of protesting against its content. And Woodrow Wilson actually arranged to have a screening of the film in the White House for members of Congress, members of the Supreme Court, and actually gave the film a public endorsement, which really silenced a lot of criticism of the film. So I don't want to go on too much about the content of the film. I don't know, how many of you have seen the film? Okay, and it's, I think today, most film audiences would see it as a bit extreme and over the top, but at the time it was viewed as historical truth. And of course, with Woodrow Wilson's endorsement, that certainly helped. So the movie faced strong opposition nevertheless, and there was a very strong protest movement led by NAACP activists, led by also white progressives. And so, at any rate, the film had lots of historical inaccuracies, but as I said, it is a very problematic, to say the least, racist portrayal of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, of course, is the era in U.S. history in which the former states of the Confederacy were admitted back into the Union, but it's also been called a brief experiment in interracial social democracy, in which African Americans, for the first time in American history, African American men exercised the vote, were able to serve get elected to and serve in political offices throughout the South. And Reconstruction governments, with this power sharing between black and white politicians, actually enacted an agenda of universal freedom. It expanded suffrage rights not only for black people but for poor whites. It established public education. So Reconstruction and African Americans' participation in it was actually a progressive social movement. One of the biggest things at stake during Reconstruction was what labor system was going to replace slavery after the Civil War, after the destruction of slavery. And Reconstruction politicians, African American politicians included, tried to increase the economic and social rights of the African American free people, as well as their political rights. Of course, this was intolerable for the former slaveholding class, and they, using the Klan and political intimidation and terrorism, were able to end this brief experiment in interracial democracy. The portrayals of African American power and agency in Birth of a Nation are just totally negative. Many of the African American villainous characters in Birth of a Nation were played by whites in blackface, but basically it portrays African American political power as corrupt, arrogant, based on the humiliation of whites, and sexualized as well. There's all kinds of sort of sexual innuendos about how African Americans in power are going to use that power to attack white racial purity, and that's where the more pernicious representations of Birth of a Nation occurred. So Wilson has his fellow politicians in the White House for a screening. He is trying to interest a member of the Supreme Court in the screening, and this person says, well, I'm not interested in movies, I think they're disreputable. And Wilson, or I think it's actually Dixon, tells him, well, it's about the Klan of the heroes. And the Supreme Court justice says, oh, why didn't you tell me? I'm a member of the Klan. So it just gives you an idea of how pervasive white supremacy was. And we could talk a lot more about Birth of a Nation, but I just wanted to say a few words about Wilson's foreign policy, in particular the U.S. invasion of Haiti in 1915. And there was a period of instability in Haiti in which the Haitian people had risen up against one of their leaders. And so Wilson sent in the U.S. Marines, and the Marines actually looted the Haitian treasury of like $500,000 in gold in U.S. dollars and brought the money to Citibank. And the Marines occupied Haiti until 1934. Haiti, of course, was an independent country, but the U.S. authorities didn't recognize it. And the U.S. understood this invasion in terms of the the ideas of racial primitivism and political immaturity that they used to justify their expansionist policies in Cuba and the Philippines and elsewhere. And this is a quote from the Assistant Secretary of State, who's obviously supported the invasion. He said, Haitians are inferior people, unable to maintain the degree of civilization left them by the French, or to develop any capacity for self-government, entitling them to international respect and confidence. And the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, responded to his encounter with the Haitian elite. He said, "Dear me, think of it, niggers speaking French." So this was a Jim Crow army. The U.S. Marines were a Jim Crow organization, many of them from the South, many of them subscribing to those sort of prevailing views of white supremacy. And it was a brutal invasion. The military commander who had served in the Philippines responded to the Haitians and the rebels with equally crude racism. He said, "They are real niggers and make no mistake, real nigs beneath the surface." And so not only are the architects of the occupation motivated by white supremacy, as I said, the U.S. Marines were a Jim Crow institution from which blacks were excluded. And Wilson's troops imposed a new socioeconomic order on Haiti, not unlike the system of economic subordination in the United States South. U.S. troops murdered, destroyed, and property, instituted a system of forced labor in Haiti, and also tore up, basically, Haiti's constitution. And as with Birth of a Nation, there was opposition from African-American organizations and progressive whites as well. Some of the people, in fact, the same people who protested against Birth of a Nation, protested against the U.S. occupation in Haiti. And when reports of the atrocities of the U.S. invasion got out, you had this opposition coming to the fore, black and white liberals mobilizing in protest of the policy, and they published a book entitled "The Seizure of Haiti by the United States: A Report of the Military Occupation of the Republic of Haiti and the History of a Treaty Forced Upon Her." There was a treaty, but it was not really a treaty in the true sense that that was sort of bilateral. This was really imposed on the Haitian people. So I've just said a few words about Woodrow Wilson and his domestic and foreign policies that were really underwritten by a sort of a pronounced, overt level of white supremacy. We could talk about other administrations as well. If you think about Reconstruction, this period in the South from roughly 1867 to 1873, when African Americans held political power and voted and could hold electoral office, that is a brief interruption in a history of white supremacy that continued, that certainly defined American politics before and certainly continued to define it after. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Siva Gurudi, as we said, and I just wanted to say that I thank you, first of all, and welcome. Thank you for coming here to listen to us today. I've been wanting to talk about some dimensions of the current policies related to the question of race for a while, and I'm going to try to make it very succinct. White supremacy, the way I understand it as a jurist, as a lawyer, is actually, and a theorist, is not necessarily white domination. We had that in colonialism, and that ended, obviously. It's not white privilege, which a lot of people might have, which is not really what is implied here. Supremacy actually has to do with the idea that every orientation of life, that life is orientation, is institutions, and the form of social organization that are connected to it have to resemble an idea of life which is associated, at least in my mind, since the 19th century to something called whiteness. And it is obviously not an accident that the idea of white supremacy, at least in the colonial context, emerges towards the end of the 19th century. It's also associated with immigration policies, children policies, population organization, who moves, who does not move, since the 19th century. Australia was much more straightforward and honest, called it white Australia. In Australia, Canada, obviously you had even children taken from their families who were native and raised differently. Because by the time we come to white supremacy, obviously the idea of extermination was no longer in question. We had natural history, European thought had evolved in that sense, so elimination was not a possibility. But clearly limiting both racially certain population and limiting the cultures that are associated with those populations had been the focus of those policies in the US, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And that obviously came to be focused on, in so many places, on immigration, and I want to talk about that slightly because that's where we are today about immigration. And the way it was conceived, obviously, in the US, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act. People know that generally. But what we don't know is the content of immigration policies after that, at the turn of the century, from 1904 to 1924, about the idea of the composition of the American population remaining the same ethnically and demographically, so that the proportion of white people stays the same in America was associated obviously to those ideas I was talking about at the turn of the 19th century, where it was assumed, of course, polygenesis. We had a lot of people in America who believed that, the idea that the white race was going to be the one carrying other races and etc. All of that stuff had been central to US immigration policy. And what I want to say is how, even today, they are still central to immigration policy, and in a way that is even imperceptible, but is very real in relation to Africa. In the US, of course, Chinese were a problem because there were a number of them in the 19th century, and I don't want to really get that. We always talk about Mexican, of course, that was a threat. But there was, in terms of immigration policy, there was an explicit desire to encourage Europeans, and not only Europeans, but certain people of certain classes from Europe, to move to America to the exclusion of others. And in America, that took many forms. Besides Chinese, you had the Insular Act, which meant that people who the US has controlled from Puerto Rico to Samoa, the Virgin Islands, etc., could actually be US subject but could not be US citizen, because we didn't want to change the demographic balance. That language is used in immigration policy in the 1920s, actually. It does talk about racial composition and racial balance. It has to be maintained. And so those people could come in, they could be US subject, but they could not be US citizen, because the idea was to keep them at bay for as much as possible. Australia, New Zealand faced the same problem with different groups. In Australia, it was the Chinese, again. But in America, obviously, people were very pleased with the fact that the problem of immigration did not concern blacks, and that was the way to control the black population. And in fact, when it was being debated, people had in mind what was happening in Canada. In Canada and Quebec, Quebec actually insisted that a proportion of immigrants be given to Quebec because Quebec is in minority, etc. But in America, people just assumed at some point that obviously if you make family reunion, education, and etc., and you have all the entire list, the list of population can migrate to America, you limit naturally the number of Africans, Americans in this country, of blacks in this country, because obviously they have no family in Africa they can invite. So family relationship doesn't work for them. Education, Africa was still backward, technically, so you didn't have to worry about that. So the concern was always about the Chinese and the Mexicans in the US initially, but never Africans, because they actually had assumed that eventually that black population would just shrink. But demographically would be limited, would be self-limiting. And that has been the case, which is why immigration policies in the US, there have never been a point where they even as they were considering demographic, the population racial composition, right? The assumption was that blacks should shrink, because if they imagine that the proportion of blacks have to be maintained in its proportion to the American population at that time, they would have done what Quebec did, which is to say we just give a proportion of immigration tickets to Africans to come here so that we maintain that. But of course, nobody had to say that because we were actually happy that population was shrinking. That's one dimension. I'm going to leave it at that. The other thing has to do with, and the way that is translated today, and I'm jumping a lot, I know that, but we'll have a conversation. The way that manifests itself today is now immigration enforcement by ICE happens. If you Google, and you have to Google, you call any immigration officer, they will tell you a number of things. The suspect categories in immigration, the most suspect groups, whose stories about family relations and etc. has always to be investigated by ICE are Africans, right? Because clearly our extended families is a problem. So it is okay, and I don't mean this to be flippant or mean, it is okay for Angelina Jolie to adopt black kids. I cannot adopt a black kid, bring them to America because they are not related to me. Because they will do a blood test, they will be excluded. Right? Any white person can adopt an African child to come here. An African child cannot come to America because they are related to an African, even by adoption, because what matters is the blood. Today, ICE actually does the blood test. Right? And if you take, and I'm just going to jump around, but I just want to give you a few things to think about. If you send, again, ICE, immigration enforcement, if you take, for instance, in the 1990s, everybody, and 2000, everybody was talking about these criminals from Nigeria, right? Whatever, all these people will send you stuff to, your aunt has left you money somewhere, blah, blah, right? What that shows actually was that both hacking and criminality in the electronic age, when it was Eastern Europe, it was actually supposed to be a sign of intelligence. And in fact, Google, yes, and Facebook went to Eastern Europe and hired all of these people were hackers because they wanted to help them learn about hacking and hack other people and prevent the etc. If those criminals in the electronic age were from Eastern Europe, Google might be interested in hiring them. If they were from Nigeria, obviously it's excludable. That's that. So smart Nigerians better not be criminals. Smart Eastern Europeans, criminal, that's a criminal man, you can convert them to good. Right? And I'm saying all of these things because what is happening today in the context of this immigration policy that everybody thinks that these people are busy deporting Mexicans. But the ones they are deporting the most today in the US today are actually Africans. And the thing is that it's unspeakable because obviously if they have family connection, they're first generation Africans, their families are in Africa, so nobody matches for them. They don't have communities to be integrated with them because there's no, even though effectively we are connected to the African American community, the family connections are no longer there for somebody to actually make a plea for them because of family connections, etc. So Africans get more deported than anybody else, and nobody can talk about it because it's a nameable problem. Because behind the whole policy, this idea of racial supremacy, meaning by limiting the number of black people population in America, has always been there, and it works institutionally through those mechanisms, and nobody's talked about it, but it's actually happening. So that's one element of what I want to share with you today and talk about. The last part, obviously, about immigration today has to do, obviously, with the real political paradoxes. And one of them is this. In the last list of countries that the US decided whose citizens the US was supposed to ban, there were majority Muslim countries in Africa. What is paradoxical about that is that if in fact people are worried about coexistence between Muslims and everybody else, West Africa has perfected that system of coexistence. Nigeria has had its problems, but in general, the development in West Africa, etc., they have coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims, Christians, and etc., has been spectacularly good in some, surprisingly not surprisingly, but spectacularly good in some places. And I give you one example. In Senegal, Senghor, 90% Muslim, 80% of those 90% belong to the Murids, but for 25 years they voted for a Christian president. Clearly they have no problem. So even at the level of pragmatics, the idea of excluding Africans either because they are black or because they are Muslim is absolutely absurd. Because in fact, if you were to learn from this arrangement institutions that have worked in that sense, it's really in Africa. All of those is to tell you that there are not only there are really, really many objective, there are many things to object about the idea of singling out Africans, even majority Muslim countries in Africa for purpose of exclusion. But the most objectionable part, which nobody talks about, is that somebody has yet to talk about this idea that immigration is meant to maintain a certain racial composition in America. And the laws, the implementation, the reflexes of the institution behind it are all geared toward the exclusion of black people. And I stop there. Thanks.
How y'all doing? Yeah, we're good. We're awake. We're. I don't know how many of you heard about last week. There was a federal judge who, in Alabama, actually allowed the white portion of a town to succeed, right? The school district, right? So you got a federal judge in 2017 telling a group of white folks who are part of a school district that is 70% black, overwhelmingly poor as well, right? So only about 30% is white and fairly middle class. And they had kept arguing with the Board of Education and saying, you know, this is not sustainable for us. For us, the white people and the middle class people, we have the resources. We're under a desegregation order. And so we're being told that we have to figure out how to balance out our school system, but it's hard. And we have, we have concerns, so please, Ms. Judge, ma'am, can you just let us take our resources and our white students off to our community and just leave the black folks behind? No one in Alabama thought that this thing was going to be upheld, right? And the judge said, the record demonstrates that some Gardendale citizens are concerned because the racial demographics in Gardendale are shifting. And they worry that Gardendale, like its neighbor, Centerpoint, may become a predominantly black city. These citizens prefer a predominantly white city. That was her rationale for upholding, allowing white folks to take their money and their bodies, that we may be contaminated by black people. What I want to talk about, just briefly, in these ideas that we often have, that things like this are a part of our past. That ideas of federal judges upholding that kind of separation based on the fact that they don't actually think that white people should be forced to integrate, to share space with black people. Discrimination based on race. For many of my students, and many of the folks who I think that I hear talking in the press, etc., that's sort of like we have laws, that's a thing of the past. Why do people keep complaining about racism? Why are people talking about this? And yet you have this being upheld and the judge saying, you know, I'm really sad about it, I understand it's upset. However, people have the choice of going to school with who they want to, right? And there's almost no discussion about that. So both for the decision and the silence, right, and the outcry, and the pushback, and the thinking about what do we do as we're watching what we understand as fundamental rights of citizenship that go back to the Reconstruction period that Kevin started us off talking about, are literally under attack. Y'all know the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments? Yes, I got head shaking, what are they? I always ask, because now the students go, yes, I'm fully aware of what those are. And then I ask, and they're sort of like, you know, the stuff, what are they? The 13th first, what is it?
Voting.
No. No, 13th abolishes slavery, right? The 14th is citizenship, nationalization. You have rights based on being a citizen. And the 15th is you have the right to vote, right? In this one ruling, you have two of those three amendments that are foundational to black freedom being overturned. And there's this conversation about it. You see how I'm getting there? Like, you see how I'm saying they're overturned? It should not be permissible to say that because I am white, I get to, as a legal principle, separate from black people, because black people are citizens and we have rights. And it also changes your ability to vote, right? Because this community had a legally elected school board that made another decision. So electoral politics were also overturned in favor of whites. So I have just a few examples that really kind of show, I think, two historical, one more contemporary, not as contemporary as last week, but more contemporary, that kind of explain how, for black people, there's some folks who are doing work around how science fiction writers are actually have proposed and continue to propose a set of theoretical interventions that help us understand racial politics today. So one of the things that you will hear folks who want to talk about the relationship of the Afrofuturism or really Octavia Butler or just science fiction is they'll say that, you know, the time space that for black folks, time is liminal. It's not really, it's not linear in the way that we tend to think of time working. Things that are supposed to be fully in the past and should be unrecognizable in the future continue to come back over and over again. So we experience the highs, the theorists who are working in this, of thinking about futurity, of thinking about how do you create a future that looks like what we want it to look like. Because in the future, in the hands of a science fiction writer, you can do that. But very often, writers who are talking about black freedom, science fiction writers who are talking about black freedom, the past is as present for them in the future as the future is in the past. And without going into a big, whole, huge thing, just trust me, time is liminal for black folks, right? So, and that would be one example of it because it would fit very neatly in the 1950s, this court case in Alabama, very neatly, same rationale, same outcome, despite it being illegal. So my three examples, the first one has to go back to this post-Reconstruction period, which really is a phenomenal period of time that can use more study, and there's still classic text to help you understand what is going on there. It's, I think, for me, it's still Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. I don't think that anybody has done as thorough, as comprehensive, as complete a job of explaining exactly what white supremacy looked like, what the desire for black freedom was based on, and the impossibility of those two things existing in geographical space or liminal time, right? So our actual system of taxpayer-supported public education comes from this period of time. One of the first things that the federal government decides is, well, for a number of reasons, some of them actually financial. However, there's a big push to say, you have to educate all these people. All these black people, the whole region of the country is gonna go down if we don't figure out how to educate these folks. And if the region of the South goes down, they're the economic engine of the entire nation. At the end of slavery, you know, what will happen to the rest of us? There were pragmatic concerns that tied economics and law around, in particular ways, to education that really got started during this, this Reconstruction period. So in that short period, as Kevin said, during formal Reconstruction, there were federal funds that were pumped into the South for the education of blacks and whites, it wasn't just for black folks. So educational levels start to rise. It's a little short period of not even 10 years. But in that period of time, you see black attainment, black achievement, black and white education really expand. As soon as those troops left, the troops are there to really protect the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? They're there to ensure with force that citizenship, voting, and the end of slavery are enforced. As soon as the troops left, there's a whole story about how that happened. During the post-Reconstruction period, one of the first, the two things that Southern governments go after are Black political power and Black educational attainment. So they started to pass laws all over the former slaveholding states that were decreeing stuff like you could not use funds, or that integrated education was a violation of the law. They decided things like all across, I'm not going to give you specific states, really, pretty much all across the state, they decided things like you can't use white tax dollars to educate Black children. You have to make sure that only Black dollars are used to educate Black kids. Some places instituted a double tax because they were like, we can't be having the taxes all mixed up with education like this. So we're going to need Black communities, who are mostly sharecropping communities, domestic workers, are not making a whole lot of money. We're going to need them to pay for the educations of whites in their school district, but then we're going to need them to pay a whole other tax to educate their own kids. And the resistance to ideas of Black education came from all over the white South. Mississippi Governor James Vardaman assured constituents that, quote, money spent for the maintenance of public schools for Negroes is robbery of the white man and a waste upon the Negro. You take it from the toiling white men and women. You rob the Negro child of the advantages it would afford him, and you spend it upon the Negro in an effort to make of the Negro what God Almighty never intended should be made, and which men cannot accomplish. A U.S. congressman during this same post-Reconstruction period, J.L.M. Curry, declared that too much education for Black folks would do nothing more than to spoil a good plowman. All over the South, elected officials, one after another, began to institutionalize those kinds of ideas. If Black education is seen as taking from white people, then they went about the business of making sure that Black folks were not educated. One of the opportunities for Black people to receive education came from white philanthropists during the period, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but they were really rich people with things like Dodge, Curry, Rockefeller. I came up with this idea that, okay, white people in the South are not going to allow Black people to have education unless they pay for it themselves. Rural Southerners, because in post-Reconstruction, Black folks are not living in the urban areas so much as in rural areas. So there's great distances. There's not a density that allows for an ease of education. So these two foundations come together, John Rockefeller, and the former president of Sears, Rosenwald. I know I just blanked on his name all of a sudden. Yes, Rosenwald. Come up with this idea of matching grants. So what they decided is, okay, if Black folks in the rural areas want to have education, what they're going to need to first do, because they need to be taught subservience, hard work, and uplift, and they need to be disabused of the idea that there are handouts for them. These are sharecroppers. The idea that they are lazy is just really, how hard they had to work for basic subsistence. It just shows the lie, one of the lies that is easily reproduced during this period. So these folks come up with this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to give matching grants to Black communities. We're going to give them $500. They raise $500, we'll give them $500. They can build a school, and then they can figure out how to educate themselves. And when you look on the surface of this is this wonderful idea. What you start to discover when you look more closely at how this scheme was arranged, before these communities could actually get the matching grant difference, they did have to raise $500, which in 2016 money would be about $6 grand. For poor folks who are working in a debtor situation, generally at the end of the year when they finish being tenant farmers or sharecroppers, they had no money. So thinking of one of these communities coming up with $500, there's all these stories about how that happened. But before you can actually build a school, you have to find someone to donate the land to you. And then you have to deed that land to county officials. So poor black folks have to figure out where we're going to get some land to put a school on. And then we got to give it to white people who are not going to support us in getting educated before any of this can even start. Black churches are big during this period. A lot of the land that ends up getting donated are black churches. But you still can't have the matching funds because now you have to go and figure out where you're getting the lumber and where you're getting the labor. And you have to donate those two things. So you either buy it, you commence to chopping down trees, you figure it out the best way you can, but you still don't get your $500 until you have figured out where the lumber to build it and who is going to build it. And then you still can't have the money because you have to then figure out who's going to teach the children and who's putting in the chairs for the children. Where's the chalkboard and supplies coming from? And those same poverty-stricken communities have to raise that. Once all of that is done, you can have their $500, right? And this is going on all over the South up until 1964. And Rosenwald did good things. He's not a bad person. But this scheme is often talked about as some sort of altruism on the part of whites for black folks. This is also a period of time where ideas about how to educate black people are getting shipped around the globe, specifically to Africa. And so a lot of these teachers end up working with colonial governments to put together educational systems for the colonized with these same ideas about what kind of education you needed to have. And the only education you can have is vocational. That's the other thing. Nobody was matching anything or paying for anything unless the education you were receiving was teaching you to be a so-called productive citizen. If we fast forward really quickly to 1954, it's just another historical moment. After the Brown v. Board of Education decision was decided, it's another 20 years before Southern schools was really, another 10 they start, but it's another 20 years before you really see significant racial integration. One of the reasons is because white folks came up with this idea of massive resistance. They decided all of us white people across the South are just going to refuse to integrate our school systems. The massive resistance campaign, talking about white supremacy in government, was called forth by this document called the Southern Manifesto, and it was authored by members of Congress. 19 senators and 82 representatives signed this document. This included the entire congressional delegation from Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, with the exception of 2 Republicans from Virginia who signed on. All the signatories were Southern Democrats, and only 3 refused to sign, including Al Gore Sr. and the future president, Lyndon Johnson. Other than that, 100 members of the U.S. Congress, sitting members of the U.S. Congress, said that they said that they consider Brown v. Board an abuse of judicial power, and that they were resisting it because the Constitution never actually mentioned education. And for a time, I was going to name my forthcoming book something like, Why Do Those N-Words Need School? Because during this period, state by state, as you go through archives and newspapers, consistently, these elected officials are saying, well, why do they even need schools? What are they going to do with that? They should be out in the fields working. Those ends don't need school. The last thing I want to talk about, there's all kinds of that. Then they open these segregation academies where they start legislating new law where they decide that state and local money can actually follow white people to set up public schools, but no money can follow black people to set up schools. So you have governors, legislatures, all coming up with rationales for how they can keep schools from integrating, basically by just starving them of funds. So just sort of jumping forward once again, so we can have a conversation to today. One of the sort of most surprising things that's going on today is the number of black people who are poor, who are being arrested on felony charges of stealing education. I tracked at least 15 of these all over the country, where you have, in one example, in Ohio, Stephanie, thank you. I'm getting over a cold and laryngitis, so the fact that I have a voice here is a little bit amazing to me, but, and I'm taking cold medicine, so I'm also kind of, in one case in Connecticut, there's a homeless black woman and her 5-year-old son. They live in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Bridgeport is a poor city in Connecticut. They slept in homeless shelters in Norwalk, Connecticut, where she ends up being arrested and charged with stealing education. She sometimes slept in her car, that if there was no room in shelters. She finally got a friend of hers that lived in Norwalk in a public housing unit in the town to let her use her address in order to enroll her son in school. She needed him enrolled in school for all the reasons that we think she needed him enrolled in school, but she also needed to make sure he was getting 2 meals a day. She also needed to make sure he was safe for 6 to 8 hours a day. All the parts of schooling and education that's a part of community and safety and mental and physical health separate from education, that was denied to her as well. So she uses her babysitter's, her friend's address. And this is during a period of time when Connecticut had decided we're really going to clamp down on all of these people trying to steal our education. All these people who should be in the lower performing areas. I keep trying to come to our schools and enroll their kids. And because taxpayers are supporting education, the town in Norwalk was like, but this is theft. They're not adding to the coffers. This is my money for my kids. Why I gotta educate the 5-year-old homeless kid who's black? They hire private investigators to follow her around. They come up with this airtight case that she does not actually live in Norwalk. And they decide to make an example of her. The mayor says, this is just, we've reached a new low. We have other people who have tried to steal education here, but this homeless black woman, that's a bridge too far. We need to make a stand. We need to make sure that nobody no other poor people from Bridgeport try to come running over here to educate their child. So they charge her with felony theft of education. It's a felony. This woman had no criminal involvement, no criminal record, but she's charged with a felony for trying to educate her kid. There's a big outcry. People come to her aid. People are kind of going, how can you do this? Let's figure out something. So somehow, the next thing that happens, she's gaining ground support. The NAACP is on her side. There's news reports. People are kind of like, this is terrible. Somehow there's a sting that's set up, and she gets caught in a drug bust. She says she doesn't know what, and it's clear it's a sting. Like they went after her. She wasn't just sort of wandering around. They set something up and caught her in this sting. And she was at that point facing 25 years in jail. So she ended up taking a plea. They joined the two things, the theft of education and this drug bust. And so she was looking at 25 years in jail. She took a plea for 12 years. She'll be out in 5 if she gets good behavior, but she will have a felony conviction. All across the country, I'm finding these cases that, again, much like what was happening in Alabama, nobody's talking about it. In Orinda, California, there's a woman who's working as a domestic help, live-in domestic help with her 7-year-old daughter. Orinda is a very wealthy area of California. The daughter, because they're in the district, she lives there. They're not paying taxes, but they are legal residents of the home. She's sending a 7-year-old child to the 2nd grade at the local school. The officials start getting complaints from parents who are like, well, why does she get to go to the school? And can we figure out, is it even legal for her to go to the school? And who's paying the taxes that make it profitable for her to go to the school? It turns into a big thing that the mother ends up having to turn guardianship of her child over to her employers in order for them to be able to enroll her child in school, for that child to get an education. The mother still had custody, but her employers were now guardians. Right? I could go on, I mean it's depressing, but I could go on another 14 times about the cases that constitute stealing education. I have not found one where the people being prosecuted are white or wealthy. I have looked. In one case in Ohio, there is a wealthier white family who does, get told, you can't keep sending your kid here, because you too are stealing education. He ends up doing a house swap with a relative who's in the district, legal house swap, hires a lawyer and threatens to sue the district. And so he got to stay, and his kids got to stay. But honestly, that is the only time that I found the district going out of their way to even try to prosecute a white person. Everyone is somebody who's low income. So education has become a commodity. Education is tied to money in all kinds of ways, but to a large extent, it's tied to whiteness. Who's seen as deserving quality education in ways large and small beyond the rhetoric has everything to do with how wealthy you are and how the extent to which we believe you to be white. And it's continuing, and it's wrong, but we really do need to have some kind of healthy conversation about what has to happen to keep this from continuing. Thank you. So we thought we would just for like 5 minutes or so, just talk about what kind of lessons can be learned from some of what we talked about in terms of survival, because when we were putting together this panel, one of the things that we were noticing is how kind of overwhelmed people seem to be in the idea that there were white supremacists holding elected office, or that white supremacy as a policy was being allowed to reign in the country. And it was Kevin who pointed out, but white supremacy has been the official policy of the US government for most of the 20th century. It's not hard to find instances where that is literally the policy. And yet communities that have suffered have figured out ways to both resist and to survive and to push back and to fight. It is much easier, it seems, in the United States, or it seems to me, to get a law on the books than it is to make sure that the pushback doesn't end up taking away whatever rights it is that you thought you had. So do you want to just think about, everybody have maybe one thing that...
I'm just going to respond to what you just told us about with this problem of stealing education. I talked about white supremacy as a sort of a national policy, sort of writ large, and I think we can talk about that, and there are many more examples, but I think your presentation really reminds us that white supremacy is being enacted and reproduced in policies at the local level. And to me, that makes it possible to imagine creative ways of challenging it and opposing it. You mentioned that no one's talking about these cases. Maybe they do sort of get some publicity, but I don't get a sense of, national civil rights organizations or even local activists sort of organizing mobilizations against these kinds of things. And it's just so poignant when you think about the history of massive resistance to the desegregation of public schools in the 1950s, that here are these kids, in Little Rock, and they're, all dressed up, and all they want to do is go to school, and political leaders are sort of mobilizing mobs of local whites to keep them out of school and calling in the National Guard to keep them out, and it's just, it's one of those kinds of sobering historical connections that really sort of makes us question the idea of progress, of linear progress in civil rights. I guess that's all I have to say for now.
I think the one thing that, what that really was little snippets from a book that literally is being typeset as we speak. And one of the things that I consistently noticed about how communities from the 1870s to 2016 were navigating this, the resistance was often under the radar. It's not that there weren't groups and communities. Today, I'll tell you, one of the things that I found is that young people in urban areas are mounting a vigorous, sustaining, and often successful campaign against forms of education in their community around discipline, school closing, the use of the school security officers, who are these folks who only exist in poor schools, where they drag people out of their chairs and throw them around. All over the country, there's student unions. Most active in Detroit, Newark, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, that are all students of color, all low-income students, who are tying fire to these school districts, man. Like, they are mobilizing thousands of students, circling buildings with their arms, showing, and they're winning. So in New York, de Blasio has a whole restorative justice plan that comes specifically from the pushback that young people have been able to mount. So much so that they got the federal government, the Department of Education, the last one, to be on their side, to start issuing, not orders, what did they say, like recommendations, best practices or whatever, like there is like white papers that they'll send out and sort of tell districts, this is what we think you should, you think you're not doing. You wouldn't know it if you weren't looking for these children. I only know it because I went looking for these children. And they really are saying around education, this is, this is not right. You're limiting our future. Forget just throwing us around the room. We know that's not right, but this is a form of slow murder. This is a form of genocide. And they're using terms like this, and they're using white supremacy, and they're doing everything from taking over school board meetings to holding rallies to putting up websites to mobilizing folks. So I think that very often, in the same way that some of what I was talking about today, we don't really know, even some of the resistance, we don't see because we're not looking for it, or there's some newspapers know it's happening, and people in communities know it's happening. But you wouldn't get the sense that there's a national network of students of color who organize themselves into a union and who are winning. And so that's at least a hopeful, I think, moment to think about.
Yeah, just listening to you two actually is, I think it had me thinking about, first of all, this question about where the coalitions that we used to fight for all these exist. The other part, obviously, is the idea of solidarity, built around our understanding of the ways in which white supremacy works and who the subject are. Because clearly, I used to reside in Maryland, and we had a very progressive governor, but he was actively defending the right of young Mexican immigrants and Latin Americans to go to school through DACA, whatever it's called, right? And this so, but so if you think about it, actually, yes, is it a paradox that when in Iowa, in the town, kids, Mexicans are being kicked out of school or their parents are being threatened for stealing education, we understand and it's a scandal, but at the same time it's happening in the black community and we don't see it. And the same thing I was saying about immigration and what ties them together obviously is that at some point we have to count on solidarity to counter all of these and to see how all of these struggles can be brought together to understand how they are connected. But the other part obviously is that within the African American community there's actually a real attempt to marginalize, and it's not just gerrymandering, etc. It's also suppressing population and population growth, or at least its ability to maintain its size. And that will have a political effect over the long term, whether we think about it today or not. But it will have to do with our ability to actually advocate for ourselves, because we will lose numbers in the House, we will see if Republicans contribute to gerrymandering the way they do, and the population size, whatever. And so all of these things, things that have to do with population, have to do with policy, and I think it will, for me, it always help me to think about what is happening in other minority groups, especially in this case, with education and immigration, etc., Mexican American, because you can't, and I had this conversation at Hopkins with one of my colleagues, that legislators were so defending the right of these kids to have the right to go to school and etc., was education was taken away from black kids in Baltimore City. But they don't see them as connected. But eventually they actually are. Anyway. Questions?
I think maybe now we can take questions, comments from the floor. Yes?
Yes, you talked about the students in those 4 urban areas. You may also be aware that in those same school districts, teachers are organizing, mostly under African American leadership, to push back against the privatization of education in those cities. The important one in Chicago, pushing back on Rahm Emanuel, one of Barack Obama's good friends. And one of the ironies is that people like Obama and Cory Booker are kind of the leading proponents of this privatization. I wonder if you could comment on that and what needs to happen to bring prominent black leadership into the fold and resisting this sort of terrible further privatization and degradation of high school education.
I mean, the relationship, I think we can all talk about how there's money to be made from oppressing black folks. It's historical, it's contemporary, it's liminal time, once again. The thing specifically about Cory Booker and former President Obama is there's this group called Democrats for Aid Reform, which was founded in the early 2000s by folks who had all helped to start Teach for America. The there's a whole bunch of young folks who had just gotten out of school, and so in 1989, they all were at Harvard. Like literally, it's not an exaggeration, they were all from Harvard and Yale, and friends with each other. And they said, hey kids, let's educate poor kids, and started this whole organization. 10 years after that, Democrats for Aid Reform, they decide, Democrats are really impeding our ability, our business practices. Unions are in the way. Having to have a teaching force that is certified in certain kinds of ways. Not allowing us all to start a school, a charter school, an unregulated kind of charter school because we just want to. The problem is Democrats need to get on board, and this Democrats for Aid Reform figured out, because this is right in the period where we're figuring out that democracy in the U.S. is now all about who's lobbying, who's got the biggest pieces of money, and so they were like, well, then if this is a political problem, then money will fix it. Let's identify folks who we can throw money at, get them on our side, and get them to help us from the inside change some of these policies. And the heads of the Democrats for Aid Reform, they're vocal. Like they talk about it, So we identified Cory Booker and President Obama. President Obama was still a senator. And we thought they would be open to some of what we were interested in having happen. And we threw all the money at them that we could. And when President Obama got elected, the direct quote is, we were playing on a much bigger field, had access to much more money, and that's when all the success started. Right, so this idea that people just had, and then they urged him to hire Arne Duncan, who you're talking about in Chicago. Like they said, you have to hire Arne Duncan. They were the ones that said, crafted the legislation, race for the top, which all the stuff about taking caps off of charter schools, teachers, all of these policies, there is pushback. Like the NAACP and this other group called the Advancement Project have filed lawsuits one after another saying this is just racist. You're dismantling education in poor communities, and we don't care if there's a black president. What is in fact happening in these communities is something else. Man, the education budget in the U.S. is $600 billion. And all of these things that are happening are moving parts of that $600 billion per year. It's a $600 billion per year industry. And so every time you score one of these victories, there's cash involved in that. And so it becomes an economic argument that we don't often see. That's something else we don't talk about, right? The relationship between, there are forces that there's too much money to be made. They're too big to allow school districts to go rogue, or to tell white folks in Alabama you can't have your own white-only system. But the sooner that we know this, I mean, again, black people, poor people, communities of color, immigrant communities, we have figured out how to navigate under these oppressive systems forever. Since we've been here, like we've figured out how to survive, if not always thrive. We have figured out how to survive it, how to do the best we can for the next generation, how to come up with an analysis that's life-giving. And some of that I find missing today. Like some of that thinking about what is survival look like. I think that's a conversation we can stay in touch.
Sabina?
Just to follow up on that, but then maybe move to general questions and it's not answered. And I'm wondering how all of you find it most productive to think about history and futurity and relationship, because you mentioned liminal history, Olivia, and this is sort of the repetition of the atrocities of history. Let's say as opposed to, right, in certain quarters there used to be, I'm sort of thinking of the 1990s, where people were way more excited to look for sort of the, what could have been, right, if things hadn't turned bad. But then I'm sort of thinking of what Kevin is mentioning about sort of looking at resistance, and if I'm doing correctly, looking at like resistance during Reconstruction, and sort of turning it on its head today, right, and make use of it. So I'm just sort of wondering also, because it seems more, maybe too generally speaking, that that sort of ideology critique has become really popular again in a way that reminds me of the 70s. And I sort of wonder what's most productive right now for you guys. Does that make any sense in terms of how to think of the past in order to try to move forward? Is that too generic and abstract? I said that at the very beginning, so feel free to not respond. I mean, what kind of histories are important to write, I guess, in order to imagine a different future right now?
Well, there's two things. There's two sort of touchstones in American history that were discussed today that I think are very important for understanding action in the present and the future, and that's Reconstruction, which was this revolutionary moment in our history which is not often taught, and then immigration policy. And we think about America since the Civil Rights Movement, and I think that most of us are at least taught to think that we have come a long way, that there's been enormous progress. But as I listen to my colleagues present, I think that there are a couple of fundamental things. Our immigration policy in the 1920s and even before, with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1887, was based on race, was based on white supremacy. And it remains so. Obviously, the people that Trump and his minions are mobilizing against, the quote-unquote, the undocumented immigrants, are not the white Russian or Irish immigrants. There are plenty of those undocumented immigrants from those parts of the world here. It's obviously a targeted, racialized policy, and it's part of the phenomenon that you were talking about, another way when we're talking about the criminalization of poor people of color, who, don't even get a hearing before they are, summarily deported. So I think it's just really important to have an understanding of what Reconstruction and the history of white supremacy in immigration policy means for the present. It means that if there's a moment of racial transformation, a breakthrough, the election of President Obama, for example, there's going, or the emancipation of 4 million slaves in the South, there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be an attempt to reinstitute white supremacy. And I think we see that with the Trump administration following the Obama presidency for all of its problems and limitations. So, yes, on the one hand, I guess for a number of years after the Civil Rights Movement, you didn't have the pervasive problem of racial terror, although obviously the Klan had a comeback in the South in the 1980s and, sort of revived lynching. But, some of you may be thinking the stuff that I was talking about with Woodrow Wilson, well, that's ancient history. That's just not, why is he dwelling on that? Well, David Duke actually used Birth of a Nation at Klan meetings to recruit and to organize in the 1990s. And of course, David Duke, who ran for office and was defeated largely by the high turnout of a very politically aware black population in Louisiana that has a sort of a political collective memory that goes all the way back to Reconstruction. They defeated Duke from holding statewide office in Louisiana. So these histories survive in the minds of African Americans in the South, and they were certainly operative if you look at even the 2016 election with African American women throughout the South voting in overwhelming numbers for Hillary in this past election. I take to heart Noliwe's comments about resistance among African American youth today, but it's really important that young people understand the importance of voting, and that all the other activism, all the other protests and marching is no substitute for voting. I'm not, it's absolutely crucial. And the youth apathy towards politics is how we get white supremacists and fascists in the government. So I would just encourage young people to know their history and vote. They need to be aware of the harm that is done or can be done by these policies to, if not to themselves, then to other people.
What I would add to that actually is that being somebody who came here as an adult, it really struck me the ways in which people talk about the American Constitution, and generally speaking how the history in America was always a redemptive one, But the thing about redemption is that there's nothing at the end of it. And so people, even as people were talking about redemption, now everybody has King's Day and etc. etc. Right, while that was happening, one of the things that also happened, which was very noticeable again for someone who came here in mid-80s, was that very few politicians in America used the term citizen. Even in election, we went through an entire campaign, you can actually check, nobody talks about citizen. We have all become consumers, customers, communities, and etc. But that's the reflection of a very sad breakdown of how we relate to ourselves as a nation. And it happened because of Brown versus Board of Education and etc. when everybody became citizen. And so our histories are not actually taught to maintain that idea of citizenship, to make sure that we understand that it's not, the history is redemptive, but the redemption is not the end of it, that this is actually their communal struggles and etc. And we all alternate in fighting. There was the civil rights movement, women's movement, now immigrants and etc. And I don't know how institutional, but I mean law, I'm not in history, so I can't speak of history. But as a law, there's actually kind of weakness that goes into just, okay, we have 13, 14, and 15 amendments pushing both sides, but then we don't talk about citizens. Why do you have them? 14 amendments made all of us citizens. If we are all citizens, why do we talk about white children? How is it possible for people in Alabama, Mississippi to say, white should have their own school? You can't have citizenship in white. Right? You can't have citizenship in white. The whole point of being citizen is that white privilege goes, and we don't have whites anymore. And if we don't, and I think that has to do with the way in which we have talked about history, but even within social movement in America, how we talk about those movements, it's all a set of accomplishments, and we never see actually the forces behind them and how they are connected to others. And I was not here in the 1960s, but when I listened to that history, I watched a lot of old movies, clips, and what I see is that, how diverse and politically engaged everybody seems to be, at least those who are on the side of change. And now we seem to go into small silos, communities, consumers, customers, you do this, I do that, this is my thing, that's your thing. And that actually is not going to be helpful. And I don't know how history makes up for that. That I don't know.
Can we have
We have
another?
one more question.
Yeah, I think we should have another question from, if possible. Yes, thank you.
I'm curious about the role of the arts in this kind of resistance, partly because you referenced Afrofuturism, and I was just yesterday using Adrienne Maree Brown's quote about our obsession with dystopias is because they make clear the systems that we have already set in motion. And I'm thinking about the reason that Birth of a Nation was so groundbreaking. The only reason I've seen it is because I took film theory in grad school, and that was the first film that actually constructed a filmic technique for manipulating human emotion.
Yeah.
Right? Reverse shot formation. Oh look, the poor little white girl running away. Oh look, the big scare. And so there's so much force and power in the arts, and it's one of the few things that seems to be a space that is intentionally and easily constructing solidarity. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about sort of what's out there, what's happening, what should be happening, what we can do here.
So, one of the things I find kind of interesting when I go to grad student conferences, other places, to just get a sense of how graduate students become, I'm usually doing because I'm supporting somebody, but how professors becoming in Africana Black studies, what they're drawn to, and two of the sort of theoretical spaces that seem to really be picking up a lot of. I'm really just so I can barely remember what I'm trying to say. But people are paying attention to. Okay, we'll just go to basic small words. Two of the things that people are paying attention to really is, like I said, Afrofuturism. So I was thinking about Octavia Butler's Kindred around this question of liminal time. I don't know if y'all know this text, but it's a Black woman from 1980s Los Angeles, who is, for reasons that I'm going into, able to teleport back to 1850 South Carolina, to her relatives, to her white relatives who live there. And she comes as herself, like with her full knowledge of what 1980s Los Angeles is like, and she's got a white husband. And she only is pulled back when her white relative calls her, right? Like when his life is threatened through reasons, again, time, space, continuum, he calls her to save him. And so she's constantly like just wandering around in the 20th century, and the next thing she knows, she's standing in front of people with shotguns, about to kill this guy, who she figures out is her relative. He just thinks of her as just random slave woman. And the only way she can go back to her time is when her life is threatened. And it can't be fake. It has to actually. So she's just kind of going back and forth, gathering information, figuring out, what do I know from the 20th century that is going to help me survive, that's going to help me understand, that can maybe change my relative in some kind of way, so that as his people move back forward closer to me, they have a narrative about Black humanity that perhaps will get passed down, right? This is fiction, like this is the role of the artist. It ends in this unhopeful kind of way. Her husband ends up coming back with her one time and just grabs at her as she's teleporting. He, as a white man, then claims her as his slave to explain what they're doing together. He becomes really enamored, with this system, and it starts to change him in ways that she can notice, but that he doesn't. And he keeps saying, it's just, I have to act like this. I have to treat you like this. We'll all be in danger if we don't play your role. And she's consistently like, I can't. She's not fitting in appropriately. Long story short, without telling you the whole story, the thing is, what happens is the past ends up changing her husband in ways that she doesn't know she'll ever be able to get over. And her relative is incapable of changing. And so when she gets back into the 80s finally, it's with a sense of almost despair that given that past, what is it? Even with the best of intentions, even me and my husband, we love each other. We are, and this system, something beyond us, keeps pulling at us in a way that we don't even have language for, right? So that's an artist helping you to think, I think. That's what she came down. Now some other people will come down on, in the far future, it's all good, we figure stuff out, like some other writers, or even Octavia Butler and some other texts. But that for me is the one that really gets at what are the past around race and around the system of slavery and the presence of we talk about the afterlife of slavery, and I'm always joking one, but we never talk about the afterlife of white supremacy. I mean, we talk about post-colonialism, we don't ever talk about post-white supremacy. Right, like that's not, people, we get to the after of these other things, but what do you do with this unnamed, right? We hardly even hear people say white supremacy. That is what it is. It is separate from all these other things. It's a global system of anti-blackness and white advantage that has an economic underpinning, but is real in a global context. And so you do have artists who are asking you to think about that, because you got to think about time. You can't only think about your moment and make sense of it, is what I think a lot of artists are asking us to consider. Like, how do you only deal with the present and honestly make sense without of understanding, but how does white supremacy still haunt the present in our very selves? And then there's some theorists and stuff, some philosophers and stuff who are also asking us to help think about that.
You will tell that I'm very literal, so I don't have an artist for it. I lost that trend. But that trend left me behind. But I'm from Durant Forest in Guinea, and we wear masks a lot in ceremonies. And people who don't know, and anthropologists have really written about the Roma people, a lot of nonsense, I can say actually. Because we are supposed to be secret societies, everybody wants to know the secret, everybody goes there and they say, this time they know the secret. If they need a secret, then there will be secret societies. And I keep reminding people that you are kidding yourself. But anyway, what masks do, obviously, is not just to hide, it is that when it is meant to, enacting different personas, right? If you have the mask, you just have the mask, you can actually afford, it creates certain barriers, and so you can actually play different games, different rules about it, because you're not the person who is there, so there's no past to it, there's no attachment, there's no whatever, it's everything. And recently in Guinea, people are actually bringing back a lot of that artist street art. It's something we want because of the economic crisis and etc. But one of the things actually that I can say about that cryptically, right, is that in my language, we don't have a word for, we don't have a separate word for tomorrow and yesterday. And the reason simple is not that language is poor. It simply is that tomorrow and yesterday are actually the same. And if you think about it, your tomorrow is somebody else's past. So you are not just responsible for the future, you are responsible for somebody else's past. You don't want to burden their own future in certain ways. And there's a lot of ways in which that's enacted, not just in language, but also artistically, and etc., which actually I find interesting, which a lot of people miss. But it's not that people actually are simple-minded. They see that there's actually profound wisdom in knowing that your future is somebody else's past.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not there.
That is a very humbling realization. Yeah, absolutely. There is one more hand in the back, and I think this will be our last question. Yeah. We're sort of running to the end of our time. Yes, Indri?
Yes, I wonder when you say that white supremacy, there's no costs. Isn't it because it is the big umbrella under which the others that have their costs and operate?
Yes.
And the global context is well, Martin Luther King really analyzed it, what is happening in any southern state. We need to better understand it. We need also to understand what is happening in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
This is how this system operates. It's ethos and the solidarity. When you mention, once again, the case of Haiti,
Mm-hmm.
more recently, when it came to making sure that the Haitians are kept in their place historically, France and the US got along, even if they have their disagreement. When it came to taking away Aristide, so that they could stop any process of democracy, they got along to him and sent him around. So my question to all of you is that permanent global nature. So those who came and created this settler state, they still maintain the structural linkage to where they came from. And the colonial system is structurally linked to the slavery. And whatever policies, the one that Professor Rooks is talking about, there are versions in the so-called post-colonial state. The global proxies of colonization, the global international organizations. It's like, if we use this Greek mythology of that, again, that creature that changes. It takes literally the different form depending on the context. That's what we have here. And that's what gives meaning the period you're talking about. All the gains that were made were also linked to the fight that was happening globally to decolonize, to desegregate. So if you could address a little more systematically that global nature of it, and the dimensions of the struggle that needs to take place.
Yeah, that's a really important point and a really important lesson. And I think Professor Brooks earlier alluded to the global nature of white supremacy when she talked about how the education policy in the South after Reconstruction was being exported to colonial governments in Africa. And so what's really interesting when you look at this period in which Woodrow Wilson and others are sort of holding forth is how white supremacy as a form of racial knowledge and racial policy for education is exported. And how, for example, I mean, there are just many examples. A global history of white racism would be a very, important project, because if you think about colonial policy and genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century is not the genocide of the Armenians by Turkey. It's the genocide of the Herero people by colonial Germany, and all sort of underwritten by notions of white supremacy. Even from a more oppositional perspective, Booker T. Washington is being solicited by South African and West African and South Asian nationalists for information about how to create institutions for the education of the colonial subjects in their societies. Marcus Garvey goes to the United States to study with Booker T. Washington so that he can form a Tuskegee Institute in Jamaica, and then becomes radicalized. The eugenics policies which underwrote the immigration policy of the 1920s that Siba was telling us about, Professor Govogui was telling us about, were picked up by the Nazis and used to sort of formulate their policies of Aryan supremacy. And eugenics was a movement that was international, that sort of was based on these global notions of white supremacy. So I could go on, and I think your question is really important as a reminder to us that this is a global phenomenon and that it's mutable and it keeps getting reproduced.
Just to go back to the history question just quickly, because I know everyone wants to go. Actually, this is where we should remind ourselves that historically also, again, even though white supremacy at the level of privilege of white people, what is privilege throughout history, at least up to this point, we should also recognize that a lot of white people recognize that the predicate of white supremacy was very, very volatile and unstable. Because, and the example of Nazi shows that you can always go to the pure white race, and that was always a danger, right? And so, again, the privilege part, if you think about the supremacy, the institution that upholds this, and the idea that there is a life form that is essentially white that people should aspire to, that actually historically has found a lot of people uncomfortable in the West, and some people actively opposing it, right? And so when some people, we were talking post-colonial, etc., for me, the first post-colonial is not actually, in my genealogy, something that do, is not actually black person, it's George Bernard Shaw, Irishman, and the Irish were the first colony, of course, we know that. And so there is, and this is the thing about teaching history, that we have to teach ourselves history about where that leads. The privileges might be uncomfortable at some point, but white supremacy as an ideology always leads to those points where it actually turns back. And the reason I'm doing this long thing is actually I'm now hearing Auguste Babel, the founder of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, right? Auguste Babel, who opposed the Herero War. There was 435 people to Bundesrat. When it was decided to attack the Herero, there was only one opposition, it was him, and he said that what was being said, that if Germany goes to war against those Africans, what they were going to go there will turn over one day and come back to Germany. It's written, it is said. And this is what happened. Göring, who becomes Hitler's deputy, his father was the one who was in Namibia governor when the genocide happened. Göring, the father, was the one who oversaw the first genocide, and the son was in this one. The German colonial army, the uniforms, when Germany lost its colonies in 1918, were stored, and it came back as a brown shirt later. So the connections are actually very, very direct. And that's the thing about our historical memory, that white privilege eventually undermines all our modern institutions, because ultimately we are going to go to the idea of purity. And it's always dangerous. So the privileges might be comfortable while we have them, we don't think about it, but it's never tenable. And I think that we have to actually, that's for me the hopeful note, that it's not tenable.
I'll just say real quickly. So 2 things. I didn't finish my last thought before because my head is whatever. So when I was talking about going to grad student conferences and seeing, and I said sort of Afrofuturity and gave Octavia Butler as one strain that a lot of grad students are right now grappling with, grad students in and around Black studies. The other one is a formulation called Afro-pessimism that is literally looking at the historical and global degradation of people of African descent and saying all of this thinking about the hopeful present future makes absolutely no sense in the face of what we have seen building upon itself so far. And these 2 things, I mean, not even coming down on I'm not even, giving a thumbs up or thumbs down to either of those, but what I find interesting is that at the same moment, I keep hearing grad students try to engage both of those things. This one that's kind of hopeful and is coming out of the arts. It is kind of like, we can imagine a future that looks significantly different, and then this other strain that is, if the history is any kind of guide for us, why would you have that hope? What does that, where does that come from? I just find it interesting. The other thing I just want to say is around this global thing. One of the things, I found lots of interesting things writing this book. One of the things that I done on the last chapter is how Teach for America has partnered with the World Bank and is now this international entity called Teach for All. Teach for All is on 6 of 7 continents. It still is using, one of the things I'm about is this idea of secronomics, where it's an ideological and economic system that is dependent on high levels of racial and economic segregation to function. It doesn't function, it doesn't work if you don't have high levels of racial and economic segregation. And so Teach for All is now, they're providing privatized education for Palestinians. They're all over the continent. I mean, all over the continent. And being invited in these privatized systems of virtual education where everything is just, it's going hand in hand with let's expand telecommunications on the continent that will also allow us to bring education in, because you don't really need teachers. We'll just put you in front of a computer now that you have internet access. And, that will help you. They're all over India. And it's the same kind of exporting of a form of education that is never good enough for wealthy whites, ever. You will never see it in a country or in a school system where the people who are there globally, you do not see these forms of educational innovation. I'm saying, quote, they're always saying unleash innovation. You don't see them anywhere where the population are white and wealthy. And you got to start to ask, what is that if not white supremacy? If deciding that globally, white skin and wealth deserve one type of education, and globally now, with the World Bank and the Clinton Foundation, before in 1991, the Clinton Foundation was big for this, that people of color and poor people deserve this other kind. And again, we don't even know this. We don't know. We don't even know what's happening. So anyway, I think.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your stimulating questions.